Welcome to Wheelock's Latin, chapter 28. In this chapter, we're going to be introducing the subjunctive mood. We'll be looking specifically at how to form and translate the present tense, and we'll be introducing two of the main uses of the subjunctive mood. First, let's do a quick review of verb characteristics. Well, you may remember we've already studied voice, active and passive. That speaks to whether or not the person speaking is either doing the action, active, or receiving the action of the verb, passive voice. And we have looked at mood. Specifically, we've looked at the indicative mood, which is the author making a statement, or the speaker making a statement of fact or non-fact. The imperative mood, which is a command. And then what we'll be looking at in this chapter is the subjunctive mood, which is the mood of potential action. We'll elaborate that on this in just a few minutes. And of course, we've studied previously the tenses, present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, and person, first, second, and third, and number, singular, and plural. So what we'll be focusing on here in this chapter is subjunctive mood. Let's do a quick review specifically of the different moods we've studied. Indicative mood points out real action that has definitely or definitely not taken place in the past, present, or future. The imperative mood emphatically commands someone to undertake an action that is not yet going on. And then finally, the subjunctive mood is the mood of potential, tentative, hypothetical, ideal, or unreal action. In English, we will use auxiliary words to help convey this idea, like would, may, might, should, may have, would have, etc. So those will be helpful to keep in mind. Okay, let's look a little bit closer at the subjunctive mood. The English word subjunctive actually comes from the Latin word subjungere, which means to subjoin or subordinate. Thus, Latin subjunctive verbs are primarily used in subordinate clauses. There is one major use of the subjunctive mood, however, that is in use in an independent clause, and we will discuss that later in this chapter. Right now, let's look at how we form the subjunctive mood in Latin in the present tense. Now, forming the subjunctive in the present tense is characterized by a vowel shift in the base or stem vowel. And we're going to use a mnemonic device to help us remember this. Now, I know a lot of Latin grammars use the traditional we fear a liar. I like this one better, he beat a giant. Thus, we're not living in fear. But he beat a giant. Each of the underlined vowel combinations here designates a specific vowel shift that is relative to either first, second, third, or fourth conjugation verbs. Third IO will follow the fourth conjugation. So let's take a look at this a little bit more closely here. Here are our paradigm verbs: lado, ladari, monao, moneri, ago, ageri, audao, audiri, and kapao, kaperi. So these are our first, second, third, fourth, and then of course kape is our third IO paradigm. Now you can see here I've got just the stem for these, and I've underlined the stem or base vowel, the long A for first conjugation, the long E for second conjugation, the short E for third, the long I for fourth, and the short E for third IO. Now what we're going to see here is that we're going to shift these vowels according to this mnemonic device. He beat a giant. So first conjugation shifts from the long A to an E for he. The second conjugation verbs, as shown here, monao, we're going to shift from a long E to an EA, from he beat, EA. So it becomes monaa, monaa. Third conjugation verbs, shown here with age, is going to shift from an E to an A. So we end up with aga. And then for fourth and third IO, we're going to go from a long I or an E here to an IA, as in the word giant. So we end up with audia and kapia. These are our vowel shifts in order to form the subjunctive present tense. And to these stems, we'll simply add the present tense verb endings. We'll look at these here in just a minute. So here's the first conjugation verb, paradigm verb, lado, ladari, ladawi, ladatum. We're going to use the E. It's a first conjugation verb, so we're going to use that E and shift the A to an E. There we go. There's the stem. Shift it to an E and add our present tense endings. If you remember, the first person singular can either be an O or an M, and here it will be the M. We end up with laudem, laudes, laudet, laudemus, laudetis, laudent. Noticing, of course, the macrons in the second person singular and first and second person plural. So laudem, laudes, laudet, laudemus, laudetis, laudent. All right, let's take a look at the passive voice. Same exact system, but we're going to use the passive present endings. So we will end up with lauder, lauderis, laudeter, laudemer, laudemeni, laudenter. And here you will see the macrons over all of the connecting vowels, with the exception of first person singular and third person plural. So this is how you form it. Again, first conjugation verbs, shift from a long A to the E, and add your present endings, either active or passive. Let's take a look at the example here for a second conjugation verb. Monao, moneri, monui, monetum. We have mone as our stem. We're going to shift to an EA, and that leaves us monaa, and we'll add our present endings. Monaam, monaas, monaat, monamus, monatus, monaat. Now to form the passive, we'll simply, again, just add the passive endings here. Aris, ter, mer, many, enter. Let's look at our third conjugation paradigm verb. Ago, ageri, egi, actum. So we're going to take that AGE stem and shift the E to an A. He beat a giant. So we end up with aga, and we add our endings, MST, mustus, int, leaving us with agam, agas, agat, agamus, agatus, agant. Now, you may be picking up here that the subjunctive first person singular here, agam, looks identical to the active indicative future first person singular, which is also agam. And I know that's going to drive you nuts, but this is just one of those cases where context will have to tell you whether or not you're talking about the indicative first person singular future, or if you're talking about the subjunctive present first person singular. So context will be key here for you here. But agam, agas, agat, agamus, agatus, agant. All right, let's look at our paradigm verbs for fourth conjugation. We have audeo, audiri, audiewi, auditum. And again, because it's a fourth conjugation, we're going to use the IA shift here from the long I to the IA, giant IA. And that will leave us with audia plus our endings. So audiam, audias, audiat, audiamus, audiatus, audiant. And again, passive will follow the same pattern, just add the R, ris, ter, mer, many, enter. And then finally, let's look at the third IO. Our paradigm verb here is kapao, kaperi, kapi, kaptum. And that stem here is CAPE. That E will shift just like the fourth conjugation to an IA. All right. So we end up with kapia plus our endings. So kapiam, kapias, kapiat, kapiamus, kapiatus, kapiant. And again, passive, we'll just add the passive endings. So this is how you form the subjunctive mood present tense. It's actually pretty simple. You just need to memorize the mnemonic device, he beat a giant, and they're in sequence. The E in he will correspond to the vowel shift in first conjugation verbs. The EA in beat will correspond to the vowel shift in second conjugation verbs. The A in A will correspond to the vowel shift in third conjugation verbs. And the IA in giant will correspond to the vowel shift in fourth conjugation and third IO. So just memorize the mnemonic device and add your endings. You're good to go. Let's talk about uses of the subjunctive mood. Now, starting with this chapter, we're going to be learning a whole list of uses of the subjunctive mood. Don't let it overwhelm you. We'll be adding just like one or two at a time, but for the next several chapters, we'll be adding to your repertoire of uses of the subjunctive mood. And I think that you'll find them not terribly difficult. So let's look first at the jussive subjunctive. Now that's a funny word, jussive. It's actually probably supposed to be pronounced jussive. I'll just say I'm probably weird the way I pronounce that. I'll try to remember to say jussive. All right, well, where does this word come from? What does it mean? Well, the word jussive comes from the Latin word ubeo, uberi, usi, usum, comes from the third principal part here. We've learned this word in a vocabulary. It means to order or to command. And so basically what we're talking about here is the jussive or jussive subjunctives express a command or exhortation, especially to first and third person. Now I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, we've already learned how to do commands. That was the imperative. But the imperative mood generally is directed towards a second person, either singular or plural. If you want to talk to somebody in the first person, referring to self or a group, or third person, singular, plural, you're generally going to use a jussive or jussive subjunctive. I need to pick one way to translate or say that and just go with it. Well, let's look at how we recognize this. The main verb is going to be in the subjunctive. So if your main verb is subjunctive, then what you probably have here, most likely, is a jussive subjunctive. Now, if you want to make a negative command, you will see that this is introduced by ne. And if you see that, you've got a negative jussive subjunctive. Now, here is how we will generally translate a jussive, and you will simply add the word let as a primary means of translating this. So here's a great example. If you're a fan of history, and Marie Antoinette famously being quoted as saying, "Let them eat cake." Well, the French is actually more like, "Let them eat brioche," a sweet bread. And by the way, just a side note, she probably didn't actually say that. Somebody just attributed to her at some point. But it's the same idea. And so the word let is simply the way you will translate this jussive subjunctive. Let's see what this looks like in Latin. There we go. Cogitem nunc dehacre et tum non erabo. Now, if you notice cogitem, you know that this is a first conjugation verb, so it ought to just jump out at you that the normal A here is what you would be looking for in the connecting vowel. That this is not there. So we think, oh, quickly, let's, he, that's an E, first conjugation, this is a vowel shift. Oh, that's subjunctive. That's kind of what you're going to have to run through in your head, recognizing that there's been a vowel shift, immediately jumping to subjunctive. So you've got cogitem, which essentially, since it's present tense, means I think. But we're going to translate it as let me think, not I think. Let me think, because again, this is the main verb here, and it's going to be a subjunctive, so we're going to say let. Let me think nunc now, dehacre, about this thing. Let me think about this thing. And et tum non erbo, and I will not make a mistake, or I will not err. Let's take a look at our translation. There's cogitem. It is our subjunctive verb. Let me now think about this matter, and then I will not make a mistake. All right, let's look at another example here. Discipulus discat aut discedat. Now, discipulus obviously is our nominative singular noun, which means it's our subject. You've got two verbs here, separated by out, meaning or. You obviously have third person singular because we have a T at the end, but you'll notice that the word discat coming from disco, discere, and discedat coming from discedo, discedere, those are both third conjugation verbs, and you would expect an E here, or maybe even I, depending on which tense we're talking about. Here, present tense, so you would actually be looking at an I. Well, we don't have that. We have an A. And so we think, okay, vowel has shifted. He beat A. Yep, A is the corresponding vowel shift for third conjugation verbs, right? Let me go highlight those. And so we think, all right, we've got subjunctive here, third person singular, active voice. And we're going to say let. Let the third person student, he's the subject. Let the student disco, here we goes the translation. Let the student either, out, let him either learn or leave. Let the student either learn or discedo, leave, discedat. All right, and then finally, one more example. Neid faciamus. Faciamus obviously comes from faceo facere. We have an IA. That tells us that we got a vowel shift, and faceo is a third IO conjugation verb, so we've got a corresponding he beat a giant. Yep, that's the right one. Vowel shift to an IA. So this is a we, first person plural, moose, right? And so it's going to be not we do or we make, it's going to be let us. Let us. Let me highlight that there. Let us. Oh, but notice this whole sentence is being introduced by ne, so it's a negation. Let us not do it. There we go. Let us not do it, or let us not do this. So it's actually pretty simple. Just learn to recognize the vowel shift and then translate it with a let if it's the main verb here is a subjunctive. So you have a jussive or jussive subjunctive. Now, the key here is, of course, going to be vocabulary. Have you memorized your vocabulary to the point where that you recognize a verb being first, second, third, fourth, or third IO conjugations? If not, this is going to be difficult for you. And so you need to go back and really hit the vocab and make sure you've got this nailed down. Let's look at one final use of the subjunctive for this chapter. There'll be many more, but for this chapter, we're going to finish up here with purpose clauses. All right, well, what is the definition of a purpose clause? A purpose clause is a subordinate clause indicating the objective of the action in the main clause. In other words, why is the thing, the verb, whatever verbing is happening, why is it being done? What is the objective here? How will you recognize it? Well, you will look for a subjunctive clause introduced by ut, or if it's going to be a negative purpose clause, it will be introduced by ne, and it will be stating the purpose of the action in the main clause. How do we translate this? Well, you're going to translate it with the auxiliary word may. This will often be helpful in translating in present tense, but you don't always have to use may. It may actually be better to translate to or in order to or something to that effect. We'll look at that here in just a second. Here's a quick example. We study Latin in order that we may know more about Rome. Why are we studying? In order that we may know more about Rome. That's the purpose clause. Let's look at an example in Latin. Here we have hoc dicit ut eos evit. Hoc dicit ut eos evit. Hoc dicit, he says this. He says this. This is present tense, active voice, third person singular. So that's your main verb. He says this. Now we've got an ut introducing a subordinate clause. You go quickly over to the verb at the end here. You recognize this is uvao. That's a hard word to say. Uvao, uvare, first conjugation verb, but it's shifted from an A to an E. And so we're going to say, we got a subjunctive verb here introduced in a subordinate clause by ut. So this is going to be a purpose clause. He says this to help them, eos. Now, you can actually translate this a couple of different ways, and all of this will be just fine. You could say he says this in order to help them. So he says this to help them. He says this in order to help them. You could also translate this, he says this that he may help them. You could say he says this so that he may help them. You could also say he says this in order that he may help them. All of these, nota bene, all of these or any of these translations are acceptable. To help, in order to help, that he may help, so that he may help, in order that he may help. All of these are perfectly acceptable. What you see here, of course, the key is that you have a secondary subordinate clause, subjunctive verb here, and it's being introduced by ut, and it's answering the question, why is this action in the main verb happening? And that tells me it's a purpose. So that's purpose clause and jussive clauses, subjunctive jussive. And those are the two uses of subjunctive mood that we'll be studying in this chapter. Make sure you read through the chapter, get a better sense of it so that when we're in class, you can discuss it coherently with us. And then finally, don't forget to study your vocabulary. Y'all have a great day.